60%. That is the number, not a quarter, not a third. In the summer of 1348, 60% of the people living inside the walls of Florence were dead within 8 months. Not from an army, not from a siege, from something so small you couldn't see it, and so fast it outran every warning you could send. Here's what they got wrong. Every painting, every history book, every film about the Black Death shows the same image. The poor dying in gutters, the wretched suffering most. That is not what happened in Florence. The wealthy died first. The fur coats, the banquet halls, the servants moving through a dozen households in a single day. The very things that marked a man as successful in 1348 were the same things that delivered the plague directly to his skin. Let's talk about you. Specifically, if you had been born in Florence in the year 1326, an ordinary person, a wool worker, no estate, no title, no castle, how long would you have survived? Here's the answer, broken down. If you stayed in the city and kept working, roughly a 40% chance of seeing 1,349. If you fled to a country villa without truly isolating, 55%, but you would carry the plague with you. If you sought shelter in a church or monastery, 15%. The priests were dying faster than anyone. If you locked your door, sent away your visitors, and didn't open it for 8 months, 70%. The problem? Almost nobody made that last choice in time. And the one man we know who did, a 25-year-old writer named Giovanni Boccaccio, survived to document what happened to everyone else. This is how the Black Death worked, and this is exactly how Florence died. Let's place you. It is October of 1347. You are 21 years old. You live in Florence, in a rented room in the Old Trarno district, on the south bank of the Arno. The street outside your window is 4 feet wide. The building across from you is close enough to touch. You work for the Arte della Lana, the wool guild. Florence's wool industry is the engine of the European economy. English and Flemish raw fleece arrives by ship and mule train, is washed, combed, dyed, woven, and finished here before being shipped across the Mediterranean. On a good week, you handle 50 pounds of English fleece. You have done this since you were 14. You don't think much about where it comes from. You should. The same ships that carried the fleece carried everything else. Florence in 1347 has a population of approximately 90,000 people. It is one of the largest cities in Europe and one of the most densely packed. The average residential district runs roughly 200 people per hectare. The market street near your workshop handles 1,000 people on a busy morning. The city is visibly prospering. The Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore has been under construction since 1296, and the nave is nearly complete. The Ponte Vecchio, rebuilt in stone just 2 years ago after a flood, is lined with butchers' stalls. The Palazzo della Signoria dominates the central piazza. Florence has banking houses that extend credit to half the crowned heads of Europe. By the standards of 1347, it is the most sophisticated city in the world. It is also a perfect machine for transmitting infectious disease. You don't know it yet. But in October 1347, 12 Genoese trading ships dock at the port of Messina, Sicily. When port officials board them, they find most of the sailors dead. The ones still alive are covered in black swellings the size of eggs, in their armpits, their groins, their necks, oozing blood and pus. The ships are ordered out of the harbor immediately. The order comes too late. By November 1347, the plague is in Genoa. By January 1348, it is in Marseille. Florence, with its constant trade connections to both cities, receives its first confirmed cases in the spring of 1348. In March, a wool merchant 3 streets away doesn't open his shop. Then his wife disappears. Then a dyer's apprentice you know by sight is found in the street one morning, black marks on his neck. By April, you know what it is. Everyone does. The question now is what you do about it. To understand why Florence died so fast, you need to understand what was actually killing people. Most accounts of the Black Death describe it as a mystery, a divine punishment, a miasma, a curse from a hostile heaven. That is what people believed in 1348. The actual mechanism is more specific and more terrifying. The disease was caused by Yersinia pestis, a bacterium carried primarily by fleas that lived on black rats. In 1348, black rats were everywhere in European cities. They nested in walls, lived in grain stores, ran along the rafters of every warehouse and workshop in Florence. A single infected rat could carry dozens of infected fleas. A single infected flea, jumping from a dead rat to a human host, could transmit a lethal dose of bacteria in under a second. The bacteria then traveled to the nearest lymph node and began multiplying. Within 2 to 6 days, the lymph node swelled to the size of an egg, the bubo that gave the disease its name, bubonic plague. The swellings were agonizing. They were followed by fever, vomiting blood, blackening of the skin at the extremities, and in roughly 70 to 80% of untreated cases, death. Total time from infection to death, 3 to 7 days. Every city the plague touched faced this. Marseille faced it. Genoa faced it. Venice faced it. Florence faced something worse, the wool trade. Raw fleece from England and Flanders arrived in Florence packed in bales that had spent weeks in warehouses, on ships, in storage depots, everywhere that rats and their fleas lived. Historians now believe that infected flea populations traveled inside wool shipments directly into the city's workshops. The Arte della Lana, your guild, was not just Florence's economic engine, it was one of the primary vectors delivering plague into the city's interior. You handled this wool. Every single day, there was a second form of the disease, and it was worse. When bubonic plague advanced into the lungs, it became pneumonic plague, transmissible through the air, person to person, no flea required. Pneumonic plague killed in under 48 hours, and its fatality rate was effectively 100%. You could contract it by standing next to an infected person on a crowded street. Florence's streets were always crowded. Now here is the fact that contradicts everything you've been told about this period. The wealthy did not fare better than the poor. In many documented cases, they died faster. The reasons are specific. Rich Florentine households wore fur-trimmed clothing, fur that harbored fleas. They held large dinner parties, bringing dozens of people together in enclosed spaces. They had servants moving between their households and the rest of the city, carrying infection in both directions. Their larger homes had more rats in more walls. The furs, the feasts, the servants, the sprawling palaces were flea delivery systems. Every symbol of wealth in 1348 Florence was an infection vector. The poor, living in smaller rooms with fewer textiles, fewer servants, and less social obligation to gather, had marginally lower exposure. Not much, but measurably lower. Giovanni Boccaccio, 25 years old in 1348, son of a Florentine banker, described what he saw in the streets of his city. He wrote that the plague set at naught both the laws of God and of man. He described neighbors refusing to enter each other's houses, fathers abandoning sick children. The emergence of a new profession within weeks, men called the bikini, plague workers who carried and buried the dead for pay, and who were themselves dying at extraordinary rates. What the medical establishment offered against all of this: bloodletting to rebalance the humors, aromatic herbs burned in the streets to purify the air. In October 1348, the Paris medical faculty published an official explanation attributing the epidemic to a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the sign of Aquarius on March 20th, 1345. That explanation was 3 years late and entirely wrong. The one intervention that actually worked, complete isolation from other humans, was understood by almost nobody, and even those who understood it struggled to act on it. Because acting on it meant accepting that your city, your neighbors, your employer, your church had temporarily become lethal. By June 1348, Florence's gravediggers could no longer keep pace. Bodies were being loaded into mass graves outside the city walls. The Signoria, the city government, had largely stopped meeting. The guild structures, the courts, the markets had simply ceased to function. You are now in the middle of it. It is April 1348. The plague is inside the walls. You know 3 people who are dead. The wool workshop where you work has closed. The master died last week and the other workers have scattered. You have a decision to make. And unlike an invasion that comes from outside, the threat here is already inside. Already in your building, possibly already in your lungs. Here are your honest options. Option 1, stay in the city and find work. The city is not completely empty. Some merchants are still operating, some food is still being sold, and the wages for any kind of labor, because so many workers are dying, have already begun to rise. If you need income to eat, staying in the city is the economically rational choice. It is also, statistically, very likely to kill you. Florence's death rate at its peak in the summer of 1348 was approximately 500 people per day. The city had 90,000 residents. At that rate, the city was losing roughly 0.5% of its population every single day for months. The longer you stayed inside the walls, in contact with other people, handling goods in the markets and workshops, the more your cumulative exposure grew. The people who stayed and kept working, continued using shared water sources, continued living in multi-family tenements, continued moving through the streets, died at rates worse than the city average. That average was already 60%, which means your survival probability staying in the city and working. Roughly 40%, 6 in 10, would not make it. Option 2, flee to a country villa. This is what the wealthy did. Boccaccio himself described it in the Decameron's prologue. A group of 10 young Florentines who retreated to a villa outside the city, bringing servants and provisions to tell each other stories while the city died below. This strategy worked if and only if you actually isolated. Most people who fled the city brought the plague with them. Either they were already incubating it when they left, or their servants were, or the goods they packed in their carts were carrying infected fleas. The rural communities outside Florence were hit by the plague weeks after the city, and the waves of urban refugees were almost certainly the primary transmission vector. Furthermore, fleeing required resources. A villa required money to rent or own. Months of provisions required capital. The wool worker in the Old Trarno did not have a country villa. If you fled without resources, you would find yourself in a village with no particular reason to welcome plague refugees from Florence, and several documented reasons to turn you away at sword point. For those who could genuinely isolate, a real property, real supplies, no movement in or out, survival probability was approximately 55%. Far better than staying, but not safe. Because the plague was already in the countryside, and location alone was not enough. What mattered was not where you were. What mattered was contact. Option 3, The church, the monastery. The most emotionally coherent response to a catastrophe of this scale in 1348 was prayer. The plague was understood as divine punishment. The appropriate response was confession, penance, community, the presence of God. The church offered all of these. It also offered congregation. Florence's Dominican monastery of Santa Maria Novella lost the majority of its friars in the summer of 1348. The Franciscans at Santa Croce suffered similar losses, churches holding daily masses, hearing confessions, administering last rites to the dying. These were the highest density spaces in the city at the exact moment when density was the primary variable in transmission. The clergy died at extraordinary rates, not because they were singled out by God, because their professional obligations required them to be in close physical contact with the sick and dying, day after day, in enclosed spaces. Seeking shelter in a religious community in the summer of 1348 was seeking comfort in one of the most lethal environments in Florence. Survival probability if you sought shelter in a church or monastery, 15%. Option 4. Complete isolation. Lock your door. Don't open it. Send away anyone who isn't already inside. Don't go to the market. Don't go to church. Don't go to the workshop. Eat what you have stored. Wait, this is what saved Boccaccio. He was 25. He had a family property outside the city center. He had money for provisions. He understood, or intuited, that the plague spread through contact, even though he had no scientific framework for explaining why. He locked himself away. He didn't receive visitors. He didn't go out. He read. He planned. He began drafting what would become the Decameron. The plague lasted approximately 8 months in Florence. To survive through complete isolation, you needed 8 months of provisions or a source of food that required no contact with others. You needed to resist every social impulse, every request for help from neighbors, every call to communal prayer, every reason to step outside, because any of those could be lethal. For those who truly isolated, survival probability was approximately 70%. The obstacle for you, a 21-year-old wool worker in a rented room with no savings, was simple. You didn't have 8 months of food, and your landlord was still collecting rent. Complete isolation was the correct answer. It was also the answer available primarily to people who already had everything. By early 1349, the first great wave of the Black Death in Florence had run its course. The numbers, when the city tried to count them, were almost incomprehensible. Florence had entered 1348 with a population of roughly 90,000. By the end of the year, between 50,000 and 65,000 of them were dead. The city had lost roughly 60% of its population in under 12 months. Some districts inside the walls lost 70%. The streets that had been too crowded to walk quickly through were now nearly empty. If you survived, through isolation, through luck, through some combination of the two, you emerged into a city you didn't recognize. The wool workshop where you had worked was gone. The master was dead. 2 of your 3 fellow workers were dead. The third had fled and never returned. But here is what no one anticipated. The labor market had inverted overnight. Florence needed workers. Every surviving craftsman, every surviving laborer now possessed something that had been abundant 6 months earlier and was suddenly scarce: the ability to work. The guilds trying to restart production were offering wages 30 to 50% higher than before the plague. Landowners outside the city, their agricultural workers dead, were offering favorable terms to anyone willing to farm their land. The legal constraints that had bound peasant laborers to specific lords The entire scaffolding of feudal obligation that had defined European society for 3 centuries was collapsing, not by revolution, by arithmetic. There weren't enough people left to enforce it. Boccaccio, who survived his isolation and returned to Florence in late 1348, spent the next 3 years writing the Decameron, 100 stories told by 10 survivors sheltering in a villa outside the city. The prologue contains the most detailed first-person account of the plague's social collapse we have from any survivor. The abandonment of the sick, the breakdown of legal and religious authority, the new social arrangements that people invented because the old ones had simply ceased to function. The plague returned. In 1363, again in 1374, again in 1400. Each return killed fewer people, not because the disease weakened, but because the surviving population had developed partial immunity, and because Florence's density had permanently declined. The city would not reach 90,000 residents again for over 4 centuries. The church, which had promised intercession and delivered mass graves, lost a credibility it would spend the next 2 centuries struggling to recover. The secular intellectual tradition that would define the Renaissance, the idea that human reason could explain and improve the world without waiting for divine permission, was, in part, a direct response to a crisis that prayer had manifestly failed to prevent. Florence entered 1348 as a medieval city. It did not exit 1349 as one. And you, having survived the worst year in Florentine history, would have watched your city rebuild from nothing. Watched the workshops reopen. Watched the cathedral slowly rise. Watched your children grow up in a world that had partially forgotten what 1348 looked like. But you would have remembered. You would have built everything after in stone. So, here is the final accounting. If you were a Florentine woolworker in April of 1348, your survival came down to one variable above all others: whether you could afford to stop working, stop going out, stop participating in the social and economic life of the city, stop long enough for the plague to pass you by. The wealthy could afford to stop. Many didn't, because their wealth was built on motion, on the parties, the trade, the constant activity of commerce, and stopping felt like losing. They died. The poor couldn't stop even when they understood the risk. They worked because they had to eat. They died in roughly the same proportions. The survivors were the people who found a way to stop, and who sustained that stopping for 8 months. Now here is the honest answer nobody wants to hear. The survival paths we just walked through, most of them required something you didn't have. Complete isolation required 8 months of provisions and a property you owned. Fleeing to the countryside required a villa and capital. Even seeking shelter required connections most wool workers didn't have. The people who survived were not smarter, not braver, not more virtuous. They were better resourced, or luckier. For most ordinary people in 1348, Florence, the wool workers, the dyers, the market vendors, the question was never, how do I survive? It was, how long until it reaches me? That is the real answer, and it is the same answer across almost every historical catastrophe. Boccaccio understood what that meant. The plague had not sorted the living from the dead by faith, by virtue, by God's favor. It had sorted them by resources. The people who survived were not the most righteous. They were the most prepared. The line between life and death in 1348 Florence was not moral. It was economic. That was a dangerous thought in a world still organized around the idea that God ordered all outcomes justly. And then, sitting in that silence, writing his stories while Florence collapsed outside the walls, he saw something larger. The plague didn't just end a world, it built a new one. The survivors of the Black Death found themselves in a Europe where labor was suddenly valuable, where the church had failed in the most visible way possible, where the social hierarchies that had seemed immovable for centuries were now clearly contingent, dependent on people being alive to enforce them. The generation born after the plague began asking questions that the old world hadn't permitted. What can human beings accomplish without waiting for divine intervention? What do we owe each other when institutions fail? What is a life worth, measured not in obedience to hierarchy, but in what it actually produces? The Decameron was published in 1353. Petrarch, who lost close friends to the plague and wrote about it for the rest of his life, was already laying the intellectual foundations of Renaissance humanism. By 1401, Florence was commissioning Ghiberti and Brunelleschi to compete for the baptistery doors. By 1436, Brunelleschi had completed the dome of Santa Maria del Fiore, the cathedral that had been under construction your entire life. Florence, the city that lost 60% of its population to the Black Death, became the city that invented the modern world. The plague killed your neighbors. It also ended the medieval order that had kept them in place. If you found this useful, the algorithm needs a signal. Subscribe, and I'll see you next time.